John, thank you for sitting down with me. I've got some quick fire questions for you to start with.
Go for it.
Coffee or tea?
Both. Always both. Start the day with. I know that's probably against the rules, but I'm a massive and colossal tea snob, and so there's at least 15 kinds of tea in the house.
I like it.
But the day has to start with coffee, not after midday.
Okay, very sensible. Cats or dogs?
3 cats in the house, so that's a really, really easy answer. The house has 3 cats, 2 chinchillas, and a snake, aside from the humans. So definitely no room for dogs.
No room at all. Morning person or evening person?
Again, it's slightly against the rules. I have to be an evening person, but I think nature made me a morning person. So I create multiple mornings by extensive napping whenever.
Wise move. Opera or symphony?
Not allowed to ask that.
I guess that strikes asking strings or brass as well.
I'm a brass player. So I was a tuba player once upon a time. So there's got to be a residual loyalty. I grew up in brass bands, so I'll always have lasting affection for the brass section.
What is your favourite instrument to listen to in an orchestra?
I really like it when a composer uses one of a slightly more unusual instrument. So I love it when you get a burst of saxophone, or a lovely bit of celeste, or an instrument used really unusually. So with some extended techniques and things like that. So I yes, anything that adds a colour that I wasn't expecting.
I'm going to ask you some more impossible questions. Yeah. What is your favourite opera?
Well, I really do try not to have favourites. I try to love my children absolutely equally. I would struggle to live without the Mozart, the mature Mozart operas, and I think those are the ones I keep coming back to. I've conducted them probably more than anything else. So somewhere in the 1780s by Mozart.
If you were to be asked to revise any opera from the past, what opera would you like that to be?
Revive as in it's lost, or
you can answer as you like. Yeah, lost opera first, maybe.
I mean, that's sort of a cheat because there's so many of the Monteverdis that were lost. I would love to get my hands on those. Love to find out what was going on in that period that is, slightly murky in the middle of his life. That would be an astonishing thing to discover.
Yeah, well, I once watched a show actually constructed around the life of Monteverdi.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just an amazing sort of pastiche of snippets that had been found from operas that didn't exist in their entirety. And then obviously the famous ones. It was just, musically, it was such a rewarding
I can imagine.
Show. Okay, so at the other end of the spectrum, if you could commission any living composer to write an opera, I'm sure there are many answers you'd give, but who would be the first?
Well, the thing is, I'm doing one at the moment. So I am currently working with Errol Wallen on a new Christmas, whether we call it an opera or a community opera, which we will be premiering next year. So I have an easy answer to that because I'm deeply involved in it, and we've had some workshops, and we're hoping we'll be working on the finished score from the autumn. So really looking forward to that.
That sounds really exciting.
That's good.
Yes. Would you prefer a standing ovation or a 5-star review?
Oh, well, standing ovations have become very, very easy to come by these days in the post-COVID world. So I think that I would prefer the enthusiasm in the room. We all love good reviews. We all want to know that that what we've done has resonated. But the visceral feeling of appreciation in the moment, in the space, is still the most exciting thing.
What piece of music do you secretly hum in the shower?
I hum whatever I've been doing last. But if it's, I remember, if you do a composer like Offenbach or Haydn, they have a particular quality of getting into your ears and under your skin that can never be released. And I found myself having to put on austere Tudor polyphony after rehearsing something like that, just to kind of somehow quieten the champagne going on inside my head.
I totally agree. What is the last book or podcast that you geeked out to?
Oh, I am mid rereading all of P.D. James at the moment, so I'm mid. She has very sound views on coffee. Every single book.
Not with tea, though.
Not with tea, no. I mean, and not all of her views are totally sound, or not that I would necessarily agree with, but every book, there are at least 2 occasions where somebody makes real coffee, and its superiority to anything instant is referenced, and the fact that it's should be taken not too near to breakfast but midday. She always lays that down. It's a fine piece of advice.
I like it. It's a good piece of advice. If you weren't a conductor, what would you be?
I thought for a long time that I was going to end up as an arts administrator, and I think I'd probably do it rather well, but it would make me go bananas. And I had always toyed with writing. It would be mad to switch one career that's impossible to make a living at to another. But I do enjoy now the fact that this work gives me the chance to write, because I get to write program notes, I get to write pieces about my work, I get to write articles about the things I'm doing. So I do get to do that.
Yes.
And I would love to do it more. But the intensely practical side of me says, why would you put yourself through that pain?
Okay, let's turn to the opera itself. You've described yourself as an ever-curious conductor. What first drew you to champion lesser-known works, and how does that curiosity shape your choices in what you choose to do as repertoire?
My curiosity actually goes all the way back to my doctorate, which was mostly about Handel and about the London theatres of the 1730s, 1740s. But in doing that, I became really aware of quite how important his contemporaries were to him, to what he was doing, but also just how rich a cultural world there was that we have tended to forget, both in that era and because I was looking at Semele, which was based on a text from even earlier, from the very first decade of the 18th century, how incredibly vibrant the theatre world was then, and there were lots of attempts to create Italian opera in England, and there was a whole generation of really talented composers. And so I came to know that world and be really interested in the way we remember some people, the way we forget other people, and also the way in which some of the lesser-known composers actually illustrate the world that they came out of better than some of the better-known composers. That often what has preserved some of the great composers, or the remembered composers, is the way they step out of their own world, whereas there's a whole series of immensely talented and interesting people who are writing, whose works are an incredible illustration of that worldview, that the kind of morals of mores, and the predilections and interests of the audiences that they were writing to. So I got to become really interested then in all of those composers who sit just slightly to the side of the ones that we remember. Fast forward a few years, and I was working at the English Music Festival. I was doing these composers from the sort of English Baroque, and I got then to know the serious English composers of the 19th century, and in particular the serious works of Arthur Sullivan. And that opened up another window to a whole other generation of people who were incredibly important in their own time, people whose influence over the cultural scene, over public taste, was much stronger sometimes than the composers we remember. And again, another world opened up. And each time this happened, it opened my vista up to the richness of cultural heritage, which we just miss out a lot of the time. That led on to people like Ethel Smythe and Grace Williams and composers who might have faced even greater barriers to their work being promulgated widely. And then you realise that, of course, the people who had the most to strive against had to be better had to be more talented. And so the fact of looking for people who've been forgotten often takes you to people who were incredibly gifted. And the fact that they were fighting against bigger social barriers means that it's more likely, if they broke through those barriers in their own generation, that there was something there worth exploring. So at every stage, this picture has got bigger and bigger and more three-dimensional. And the picture we have of the past necessarily is incredibly partial. And what I love doing is taking that picture and without diminishing in any way the composers that we already know and love, showing how much more there is around the edge, and trying to show that they fit into a much richer picture than we sometimes appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. It must be interesting. You talked about preferring the later Mozart, so the 1780s, rather than the earlier ones, and of course, that opportunity to develop is not necessarily present in all of the people that you're talking about, because of the opportunities that they had to put on and stage for works. But you have an uncanny knack for choosing great works. Multiple of your recordings have won awards: the Dancing Master, the Dragon of Wantley. And we've got our fingers crossed for the Seal Woman. How do you choose which works from presumably there's very many works that you could bring back?
There are very many. The practical limitations are they're not all published. They're not all in a workable state at the moment. So we're completely reliant on brilliant musicologists to have revived them, to have typeset them, all the work that you did on this, to transfer handwritten sources into a workable force. That's really one. So that has to have happened. Then the good indication, obviously, is if the piece was successful at the time, and that obviously guided me certainly. Not so much the Dancing Master, which had a very fascinating and checkered history with the BBC, but certainly the Dragon of Wantley was more popular than any of Handel's operas in the 18th century London by an astonishing measure. And then with someone like Ethel Smythe, and when we recorded Der Wald, although it suffered from some really difficult and quite vitriolic reviews, particularly when it transferred to New York, and the fact that she got it through all those stages, you think, well, there had to have been something there for it to have made it as far as it got, despite the barriers. So I'm always looking at the historical context of how it came about as a reasonable guide to whether it's going to be interesting for audiences. But as you say, there are so many of these pieces that there's just a world. And we live in a world now where there's a paradox between the fact that there's more music available than there's ever been, but at the same time, that can be wildly disorientating, and audiences can feel that that's a little bit too much and be inclined to retreat to their comfort zones. And so I'm just trying to gently tease them away from that and make it inviting to explore these untrod pathways and reassure people that what's along them is actually very familiar to them, that these are composers who are working alongside people they already knew, people they already knew, already know, and that the world that they're writing in is actually one that people will find inviting.
Yeah, it's nice that the Seal Woman sits in that sort of Elgar space. I'm not sure Grant Bantock would appreciate being.
I'm sure he would, but it sits in that really interesting space that he's. You've got an Elgar inheritance. You can feel the continental inheritance of. You've got Richard Strauss and the sort of post-Wagnerian chromaticism, the intellectual inheritance of all of the folk song collectors. Obviously that comes through Kennedy Fraser as well, but at that time Bartok and Kodai are working on folk song collections. That idea is that music can be revived by connection to national traditions. So it's sitting inside that nexus, which was incredibly fertile for a whole range of composers.
And there was a real spirit of Celtic revival was happening also in the 20s, and Granville Bantock wrote to Marjorie Kennedy Fraser that they really wanted to set about writing the first national folk opera. So this was a really important element. I guess we've worked on the opera for a long time, and I can see now how well the folk songs integrate into that post-Wagnerianism you've just talked about. How does it feel for you? Do you think that the two contrasting styles blend together well? Or?
I think they do, but I was really worried about it. I think it would be, I have to be completely honest, opening the score, I looked at it and thought, is this going to integrate? Are these folk songs, which are presented much more faithfully than they are in those composers we've already mentioned? Kodály and Bartók and Vaughan Williams, when they use folk material, it's usually considerably adapted to their symphonic language. And Bantock and Kennedy Fraser are very, very austere about maintaining the folk songs in a very pure form. And so the potential for that to sit uncomfortably with the linking material, which is Bantock's own work, seemed to me, when I first looked at it, to be a real danger. But he's incredibly clever. He uses just enough of those melodic fragments, creates leitmotifs out of the folk material, and he works those into this chromatic language to a degree that I think it's incredibly clever how he does it, how subtle it is, and he does just enough to make the two flow into one another. And of course, he does keep all of the folk music as diegetic. So I think that helps, since it is always a character singing a folk song on stage. That means that we accept that switch from a rich, dense chromatism to something very diatonic, very four square, very simple.
So one of the things that I think has been really interesting about the process of bringing this work back is that Marjorie Kennedy Fraser, she went and collected the folk songs. You might call her an ethnomusicologist today, but we definitely wouldn't have called her that at the time, I suspect. And there's some 20 or more folk songs in the work, and she even sang the Cailleach, which in the first performance. I guess my question is, can you hear her personality in the score, do you think?
I think you hear her personality in that really profound sense of nostalgia in the score, actually, rather than in any detail. That sense of fear that a whole tradition is in danger of being lost. The way that the folk songs integrate with the characters, but also the way they're used for the non-vocal portions of the score. For the oarsmen rowing, for the preludes, the sense that if this music is not somehow brought into the 20th century, it could disappear forever. Because she's clearly wrestling with that all the time, and you see that in the preface to the songs, that she feels very conflicted about how she knows she's compromising the musical material by writing it in staves, by adding bar lines, by adding harmonies. She knows that she's already compromising what she's got there, and that she's imposing modern European just intonate, well, not equal temperament, and that these songs wouldn't have been sung like that. So she is very, very ambivalent about it, but at the same time, at this point in time, can't see the idea that recording is going to save this music. And that's we're at an interesting point in history, because she does use a phonograph, but at that point she can't imagine that would ever become such a widespread instrument that might do the job for her. So there's a kind of delicious but also bittersweet irony that we are going to commit to disc this music, which she thought she had to write down because she didn't see this as ever being a way of saving it.
It's really interesting to have that sort of lens on it. I think that it's really clear that the musical identity in the score belongs both to Kennedy Fraser and Bantop, but also the story itself. I think. I guess the thing I'm interested is how you describe how they work together from your research.
I think from my research, what's remarkable is you can't tell. Because I've picked this up very much from the finished score, you really can't see the two distinct personalities, and that's what makes it clearly a very successful collaboration. The folk songs obviously are hers, and you can feel her sense of choice. But the way in which it's been integrated is so seamless that the two personalities seem to be quite well infused into one another.
And then there's the personality of the story itself. So the story tells the Selkie legend, and of course there's quite a lot of magic involved in that. How does that come across musically? What have they done to
Well, there's fabulous harmonic and orchestral effects, and this is where Bandlik is such a genius, because it's only an orchestra of 16. He wanted it to be larger. The size of the orchestra pit demanded that it be.
I thought you were going to say there was no money.
There was no money. Well, I'm sure there was no money either. But the effects that he can create, that small group of people, are really remarkable. The Divisi string writing gives you an opulence that you really shouldn't be possible with that small number of instruments. And then the use of the harp, the use of the string harmonics, really, really beautiful shimmering effects that he uses both to characterize the seal woman and her sister, but also then the magic that they do. It's a really impressive use of minimal resources.
I think, speaking as a conductor myself, sort of finding and reviving a forgotten work is a real treat. But I had an insight into your process for doing this, which was really nice. But as you prepare, you described you seeing your role as the composer's representative in the room. I wonder what you might have meant by that, and kind of when you're preparing a score, how do you translate the world you were talking about before to the players that are coming at it for the first time, and their singers, of course?
So there are two separate questions there, I think, but I do see my role as trying as much as possible to understand the world that the composer and the librettist emerged from, to understand what the music meant to them, what the society was like that they were presenting it to, what they imagined the audience to understand by the musical and literary references that they were using, to try to understand their kind of social, religious, political worldview, not necessarily specifically what they themselves thought, but what the people in the society that they were writing for would have understood. So I try to come at the music as much as I humanly can from the world that it emerged from. And I think that's something that then I am taking into the rehearsal room. And I try to take my personality out of that music making bit, out of the bit that's the generation of the music. Obviously, my personality is fully alive and well in the human business of talking to people and working with them. But in terms of that musical idea, I do try to let myself go and try and be as they would be in the space, and to try and hear what they would hear. In terms of communicating that, well, I mean, you know, because we work together now, I don't like to say too much. I hope that by doing all of that, I will that will then naturally come through everything I say and do. And what I tend to say and do, particularly in recordings, which are always pretty time pressured, is to say as little as possible and for it to be really short and to the point and very, very practical. The poetic ideas are here. I try not to waste time or patience in a studio situation by talking about them. I hope that if they're clear enough in my mind, they'll come out in what I do. And I try to be as sensitive and collegial a colleague in the room to make sure that everyone is able to contribute to that and take as many pressures off the players and the singers as I possibly can. And I really do think that's quite an important part of what conductor does, is to take pressure away from people. It's another, we've already talked about a couple of paradoxes, but I think one of the paradoxes of conducting is that by taking control of the tempo, of the balance, of that shaping, actually what you're trying to do is remove that anxiety from people so they can get on with doing what they want to do and perform.
Yeah, because it must be, for example, the Seal Woman, the role, there's no examples to listen to or no traditions in how to sing it. No. So the singer is completely inventing those for themselves.
Completely exposed. And also by the time we get to 1924, it's very hard to even to intuit what the style would be. The contrast would be if you discovered an opera written in 1775, even if you didn't know the composer, you'd have a pretty good idea if you knew where it was written, what the style, what the singing style, what the instrumental style, all of those performance traditions, you could make a pretty good guess. But music had become so complicated that the traditions that were all alive by second decade, third decade of the 20th century are so rich. You've got jazz, you've got the folk revival, you've got expressionism, you've got serialism, all flourishing. So you are left in a very exposed position in trying to imagine what a stylistically appropriate approach is.
I think I feel quite pleased that you kept all of those conflicting ideas inside.
Well, exactly. Nobody else needs that anxiety.
No, absolutely. I guess, how do you make a decision in that? Because you've made the decisions in terms of what you're trying to convey musically. So how do you get to a position where you know the path that you're going to take?
I think you have to base it on the musical and historical information that's available to you. And when that runs out, you have to be secure enough that you've done the work that you can to make an instinctive judgment. And remember that it really isn't the worst thing in the world if that call is wrong. It's only ever a musical decision in the moment, and nobody will suffer unduly if you make a bad call on that. One of the examples I try to think in my mind is, well, if I'd been the assistant conductor on the first production and the composer had been called away and I had to make a decision in that moment, do I think they would be upset at the call I made?
Yes, okay.
And that's and maybe not so much with this piece, but I kind of think, well, with Sullivan, with the Gilbert and Sullivans, if I'd been sent out to give a performance in Boston and couldn't get a telegram back to London and I had a problem to solve, would they have been upset at the decision? Not is it perfect, because perfection is not really something we deal with in music. It's only ever is it the thing in this moment that makes the most sense.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate your time. I've got just one final question for you. Another lovely quote of yours. You said, you love to encourage audiences to rediscover curiosity and love of novelty. Why was now the right time to bring the Seal Woman to the studio? And what do you hope it will leave people today with?
Well, the simple answer is it's the centenary of its first performance, and that seemed an excellent reason. I also think this was the moment because we have shown pretty successfully the legacy of Retrospect's previous recordings, as well as mine, has been to demonstrate that there was a really, really wonderful and vibrant tradition in Great Britain in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century of music that was really infectious and that audiences had a massive enthusiasm for. And I think we've built enough faith with audiences that now is a good moment for this. I think audiences will take from it the sheer lyrical beauty. I think that's one thing it's hard to convey without having a chance to hear it, but people will be able to do that soon. The ravishing lyricism of this work. I mean, it really is, it is profoundly beautiful. And that sense of yearning for a Scotland and a Hebrides and a folk tradition that was slipping away is an incredibly powerful, bittersweet emotion.
I have to listen to it to find out.
We'll
Thank you,
have to
John.
listen
I really appreciate
Thank you for
our hilarious cup of tea. Thank you.
Actually, it's coffee.